The father's justice. The boardroom was already set when I arrived, the kind of space designed to make decisions feel heavier than they were. Floor-to-ceiling windows pulled the morning light across a long, polished table, each chair placed with deliberate symmetry, each nameplate aligned like a quiet hierarchy, no one questioned. At the far end, cameras were mounted, their red indicators blinking steadily, capturing everything for the webcast that would reassure investors this company still had control. I stepped inside, carrying a bouquet of white lilies and eucalyptus, the faint scent cutting through the sterile air. Someone had asked that I bring them up for the announcement, a small detail meant to signal partnership. No one looked at me when I entered, not immediately. Conversations continued in low, confident tones. Papers shifted, a pen tapped lightly against glass. Charles Whitmore stood near the head of the table, speaking to two board members as if the room belonged entirely to him. His posture was relaxed, practiced, the kind of ease that comes from never having to question your place. He glanced in my direction briefly, just long enough to register that I had arrived, then turned back to his conversation, without pause. "Set those down," he said, not looking at me, his voice carrying just enough authority to assume compliance. I didn't move toward the side table. Instead, I walked along the length of the room, past the empty chair without a nameplate, toward the man seated halfway down, Lucas Bennett, the incoming CEO. He looked up as I approached, a stack of printed slides in front of him, fingers resting still, as if he'd paused mid-thought. I shifted the flowers slightly in my left arm and extended my right hand. "Welcome," I said, steady, clear. "I'm Robert Hayes." For a moment, Lucas met my eyes, uncertain, then glanced past me. That was when Charles turned. He took in the scene in a single sweep. My outstretched hand, the flowers, the absence of any introduction. His expression changed, not dramatically, just enough to signal a decision had been made. "I don't shake hands with low-level employees." The words carried across the room without resistance. Conversation stopped. A chair creaked somewhere to my left. One of the assistants near the back froze mid-step, a folder held halfway to the table. No one corrected him. Lucas's gaze dropped back to his papers. One of the directors let out a short, awkward laugh, then quickly looked down. The cameras continued recording, their red lights steady, indifferent. I kept my hand where it was, not out of stubbornness, just long enough to let the moment settle into the room. 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough for the silence to become something people could feel. Charles watched me now, more directly, expecting, perhaps, that I would step back, apologize, disappear into whatever role he had already assigned me. I lowered my hand on my own terms. The flowers found the table with a soft, controlled sound. I took the empty seat at the far end, the one without a name, and sat without asking permission. Charles turned away first. "Let's begin," he said as if nothing had happened. The first slide appeared on the screen, titles, projections, language that suggested stability, but the room had already shifted, even if no one was willing to admit it yet. I leaned back slightly, watching him speak, listening to the rhythm of his voice, as he outlined a future that depended on assumptions no one had questioned. Then I spoke. "Before you go any further, there's something you should know." He paused, just for a fraction of a second, and that was the moment everything started to come apart. I've spent most of my career in rooms where the numbers look clean and the people don't. Summit Ridge Capital doesn't advertise, doesn't chase attention, and doesn't need a logo on a glass tower to be taken seriously. We operate quietly out of offices that feel almost understated for the size of the decisions made inside them. Frosted glass, neutral walls, long tables without distractions. The kind of place where conversations are short and expectations are not. We write large checks, but we don't offer second chances lightly. Capital, in my experience, is never just money. It carries weight, it exposes judgment, and it tends to amplify whatever is already there in the people handling it. I've seen companies with solid fundamentals collapse under leadership that treated responsibility like a suggestion. I've also seen average businesses survive because someone at the top understood how to listen. At Summit Ridge, we don't interfere with operations unless we have to. We don't sit in daily meetings or micromanage departments. What we require is simpler than that, and harder to fake. Discipline with other people's money. Clarity when decisions matter. And a baseline level of respect for the people who make the company function, long before executives walk into a room. I didn't learn that from textbooks. I learned it in treasury departments, where the fluorescent lights never quite shut off and the numbers never quite stopped moving. 10 years managing liquidity, debt covenants, and conversations with lenders who spoke politely while adjusting risk behind closed doors. You start to notice patterns. Who deflects? Who listens? Who treats a question like a threat? When I left to build Summit Ridge, it wasn't to do something louder. It was to do something cleaner. Fewer deals, clearer lines, no tolerance for behavior that turns manageable risk into avoidable damage. Because sooner or later, the numbers always catch up, and so does everything else no one bothered to measure. 3 years before that meeting, I sat in a different conference room reviewing what looked like one of the cleanest deals we had ever seen. Mesa Steel needed capital to modernize its facilities, and on paper, everything lined up. Revenue was stable, contracts were solid, and margins were improving. The CEO came highly recommended. Former military, direct, efficient, the kind of profile investors usually trust without hesitation. We moved through diligence without friction. Site visits, financial audits, and management interviews. I remember walking through one of their plants late in the afternoon, the light from the loading bays stretching across the concrete floor while supervisors checked production logs at the end of a shift. It felt controlled, organized, predictable. 2 days before closing, a clip surfaced. It wasn't a leak from a competitor or a regulatory issue. It was a recording from an internal town hall. The CEO stood on a small stage, sleeves rolled up, speaking to a room full of employees who had just been briefed on new productivity targets. At first, his tone was measured. Then it shifted. "If you can't keep up," he said, pausing just long enough for the room to settle, "there are plenty of places that will pay you to be average." Someone in the audience laughed. Not many, just enough to make the moment land. The video spread quickly, not publicly at first, but within the industry. Vendors started asking questions. A union rep referenced it in a negotiation call. By the time it reached broader circulation, the narrative had already formed. The numbers hadn't changed, but the company had. We debated walking away. I remember sitting across from one of my partners, the deal model open between us, still perfectly intact. "It's noise," he said. "Optics. The fundamentals are still there." We closed anyway. Within 6 months, the noise became operational. Work slowdowns, contract tensions. Regulators are asking for clarification on workplace conditions. Clients who had been reliable started inserting new clauses into agreements. Nothing catastrophic on its own, just enough pressure, in enough places, to change the trajectory. We recovered our capital, eventually, but the cost wasn't financial. It was the realization that I had ignored something I had already seen, and the question of what it would take for me not to ignore it again. After Mesa Steel, I changed one thing that most people never noticed, and the ones who did usually underestimated it. Every agreement we drafted at Summit Ridge began to include a specific clause, buried deep enough to look routine, but written with exact language that left very little room for interpretation. We called it a conduct integrity provision. On paper, it was simple. If senior leadership engaged in behavior that could be documented and shown to materially damage the company's reputation during our negotiations, we retained the right to withdraw our capital immediately. No delays. No penalties. No renegotiation. The commitment would simply disappear. I remember the first time our legal team pushed back. We were sitting in a conference room with the contract spread across the table, pages marked with colored tabs. One of the attorneys tapped the paragraph with a pen and leaned back slightly. "It's enforceable," he said, "but it's aggressive. Most clients will want this softened." "Then they're not our clients," I replied. From that point on, it became standard language in every deal. Not highlighted, not explained unless someone asked directly. Just there, in the same font, same spacing as everything else that people tend to skim when they're more focused on valuation and timelines. Most executives treated it exactly that way. They flipped past it, trusting their lawyers to handle the details, assuming it was just another layer of legal noise. A few asked questions. Fewer insisted on revisions, and even then, they usually focused on technical phrasing, not the intent behind it. Charles Whitmore never asked. I watched him review the agreement during one of our final sessions. He turned the pages quickly, stopping only where numbers were bolded or sections were flagged by his team. When he reached the clause, his eyes moved across the text for a few seconds. Then he sighed. No pause, no clarification. Just a signature on a line that would later define the entire outcome. Phoenix Industrial didn't come to us as a success story. It arrived as a problem that had been carefully dressed up to look manageable. The numbers told a familiar story, if you knew where to look. Debt layered on top of debt, short-term obligations masking long-term exposure, interest payments quietly consuming more of the company's cash than anyone wanted to admit out loud. On paper, the acquisitions looked impressive. A logistics software firm in Austin, a specialized aerospace manufacturer outside Tucson, a construction company with government contracts up north. Each one came with its own presentation, its own rationale, its own promise of synergy that never quite materialized once the ink dried. Individually, they weren't bad businesses. Together, they didn't belong under the same roof. I spent several afternoons reviewing their internal reports in a dim conference room overlooking the city. The blinds were half drawn, letting in narrow strips of light that cut across spreadsheets and printed summaries stacked in uneven piles. The pattern was consistent. Revenue from the core defense manufacturing division remained stable. Contracts with federal agencies were intact. Production timelines were being met. The people on the ground were doing their jobs. But above that layer, the structure was strained. Too many executives are tied to past decisions. Too many overlapping costs from acquisitions that had never been integrated properly. Cash flow that should have supported growth was being redirected to service obligations created years earlier. Every quarter, the margin for error narrowed just a little more. By the time they approached Summit Ridge, the urgency was no longer subtle. Vendors had begun tightening payment terms. Credit lines were nearing their limits. Internal projections assumed conditions that no longer existed. They needed capital, not as an advantage, but as a correction. The number they presented was precise. $1.8 billion. Not for expansion, not for innovation, just enough to stabilize the structure, reset the balance sheet, and give the company a chance to function without constant pressure from its own decisions. The business itself wasn't broken, but everything built around it was. Charles Whitmore didn't build Phoenix Industrial. He inherited it. The name carried weight in certain circles, tied to a family that had been in Arizona long before most of the city existed in its current form. Mining, land, early infrastructure, the kind of history that turns into quiet wealth over generations. By the time it reached him, the foundation was already in place, along with the expectation that he would maintain it. He wore that expectation well. Tailored suits, measured tone, the kind of presence that suggested authority without needing to prove it. But when you sat across from him long enough, the gaps became visible. He spoke in broad terms about growth and positioning, about market confidence and long-term vision, but rarely about the mechanics that actually kept a company operating day to day. In one of our earlier meetings, I asked a simple question about production bottlenecks at one of their facilities. He paused, just briefly, then redirected the conversation toward strategic alignment. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't listening for it, but it told me what I needed to know. He didn't see the details as his responsibility. That pattern showed up everywhere. When we discussed debt structure, he deferred to his finance team without engaging. When governance changes were mentioned, he framed them as unnecessary complications. He listened, but only to the extent that it didn't challenge his position. What stood out more than anything was how he described the deal itself, not as a negotiation, not as a partnership, but as an opportunity we should be grateful to participate in. The phrasing was consistent. our transaction, our timeline, our terms, as if the capital required to stabilize the company was secondary to the role he believed he was offering. During one session, as we reviewed the proposed structure, he leaned back slightly in his chair and glanced at his watch before speaking. "You understand," he said. "This isn't something we need to do. It's something we're allowing to happen." There was no edge in his voice, no attempt to provoke, just a statement delivered with complete confidence. And in that moment, it became clear that he wasn't evaluating the deal the same way we were. The boardroom had been arranged long before anyone important arrived. The table ran nearly the full length of the room, its surface polished to the point where the overhead lights reflected in a clean, uninterrupted line. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, but the blinds had been angled just enough to soften the glare without dimming the space. Everything felt controlled, measured, and prepared for an audience that wasn't physically there. Cameras were already in position, one fixed toward the head of the table, another angled toward the center, a third set wide to capture the entire room. Small red indicators blinked steadily, confirming the feed was live or ready to be. A technician in the back adjusted a cable, then stepped aside, leaving the room to settle into its own rhythm. Lucas Bennett sat halfway down the right side, a stack of printed slides aligned carefully in front of him. He flipped through them once, then again, not reading so much as confirming their order. His posture stayed upright, but there was a tightness in the way his fingers paused at the edge of each page. When someone spoke near him, he nodded, without fully looking up, as if conserving focus for what was coming. Across from him, Edward Collins had a different kind of presence. His materials were spread in a controlled pattern, tabs marking key sections, a pen resting parallel to the edge of the folder. He wasn't rehearsing, he was verifying. Occasionally, he would glance at a specific line, make a small notation, then return to stillness. The kind of concentration that suggested he was already running through outcomes no one else had voiced yet. I entered without interruption. No one announced me. No one redirected the room. Conversations continued at a low volume, overlapping just enough to create a steady background hum. I carried what I had been asked to bring, the arrangement held carefully to avoid brushing against the doorframe as it closed behind me. "Set that over there," someone said, not unkindly, but without looking. I moved further into the room instead. There was a seat at the far end of the table. No nameplate, no folder, just a chair positioned slightly outside the main grouping, as if added after everything else had been finalized. I paused beside it for a moment, taking in the layout, the spacing, the way every other position had been clearly defined. Then I sat. No one objected. No one acknowledged it either. From that angle, the entire room was visible. The head of the table, the central positions, the cameras, the screens, were waiting to display projections that assumed a certain outcome. Conversations continued, but with less certainty now, as if the presence of something unaccounted for had shifted the balance slightly. Lucas adjusted his papers again. Edward glanced up briefly, his eyes moving from me to the empty space in front of me, then back to his notes. At the head of the table, Charles Whitmore continued speaking, unaware or unconcerned with the details that didn't fit the structure he expected. For a moment, everything held in place. And then the meeting began to take shape in a way none of them had planned. The moment came without announcement. No shift in lighting, no pause in conversation. Just a small opening in the rhythm of the room that made it possible. Lucas Bennett had just finished aligning the last page of his presentation when I stood and moved toward him, closing the distance at a measured pace. The sound of my steps was softened by the carpet, but close enough for the nearest microphones to register. I adjusted my grip slightly, freeing my right hand. "Welcome," I said, my voice level, directed at Lucas as much as anyone listening. "I'm Robert Hayes." My hand extended across the edge of the table, steady, open, nothing forced about the gesture. It was a simple introduction, the kind that usually passes without attention. Lucas looked up, caught somewhere between instinct and hesitation. His eyes moved from my hand to my face, then past me, toward the head of the table. His fingers, which had been resting on the corner of the document stack, stilled completely. That was when Charles Whitmore turned. He didn't rush the movement. His chair shifted slightly as he pivoted, one hand still resting on the polished surface, the other adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. His gaze moved first to my hand, then to the flowers resting on the table behind me, then finally to my face. There was a brief pause, just long enough to register context, or what he believed the context to be. I don't shake hands with low-level employees. He didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. The room carried it for him. The words traveled cleanly across the table, picked up by the microphones, absorbed by the silence that followed. A chair leg scraped lightly somewhere to the left. One of the board members exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh, then caught himself halfway through. In the back, a member of the communications team froze with a tablet in hand, eyes flicking briefly toward the cameras as if checking whether they were still recording. No one corrected him. Lucas's gaze dropped almost immediately, returning to the papers in front of him, though he didn't turn a page. His posture tightened, shoulders drawing in slightly, as if reducing his presence would shorten the moment. Across the table, Edward Collins stopped writing. His pen hovered just above the margin of a page, unmoving. He didn't look at Charles. He looked at me. I kept my hand where it was. Not rigid, not demanding, just present. The space between us remained unchanged, measured in inches that suddenly felt more deliberate than before. 1 second passed, then another. The room adjusted around the silence, small movements that didn't quite resolve into anything. Charles watched, waiting. There was a flicker of impatience in the way his expression settled, as if the outcome should have already been clear, as if the correct response had already been defined, and I was simply late in delivering it. I let the moment stretch just long enough to become undeniable. Then, slowly, I lowered my hand. Not because he had dismissed it, but because I had decided the introduction was complete. For a brief second, nothing replaced it. No immediate words, no shift back into conversation. Just the quiet recognition that something had been set in motion, even if no one in the room was ready to name it yet. And somewhere in that silence, a question began to form that none of them had considered before. I waited until Charles resumed speaking, until the slide changed, and his voice settled back into its practiced cadence. That was when I spoke, not louder than him, just precise enough to interrupt the rhythm he relied on. Before you go any further, there's something you should confirm. He stopped mid-sentence, irritation passing across his face before he turned toward me again. This time, he didn't dismiss me immediately. There was a brief calculation in his expression, as if he was deciding whether the interruption deserved attention. "We're not taking input from support staff," he said, controlled, but sharper than before. "If you have something to add, you can pass it along after the session." "I wouldn't wait," I replied. That shifted the room. Edward Collins looked up first, not abruptly, but with a focus that suggested he had already connected something others hadn't. His eyes moved from me to the documents in front of him, then back again, as if aligning two separate pieces of information. Charles exhaled slowly. "Then make it quick." "I'm not here as support staff," I said. "I'm Robert Hayes, managing partner at Summit Ridge Capital." The words didn't land all at once. They moved through the room in stages. A director at the far end leaned forward slightly. Someone in the back lowered their phone. Lucas Bennett finally looked up, fully this time, his attention no longer divided. Edward didn't speak immediately. He reached for his folder instead, flipping to a section marked with a tab he had already prepared. His movements were controlled, but faster now, guided by recognition rather than routine. "Before we proceed," he said, directing the room without raising his voice, "we should review the authorization structure." Charles frowned. "That's already been handled." "From the Capital Controller," Edward clarified, his gaze steady. "Specifically." Silence followed. I didn't move. I let them reach the conclusion on their own. Edward found the page he was looking for and turned it slightly so the nearest director could see. "There's a provision here," he continued, tapping the paragraph lightly. "Conduct integrity. It allows for immediate withdrawal under certain conditions." Charles waved a hand, dismissive. "Standard language. Legal reviewed it." Edward didn't respond to the tone. He read instead, each word clear, deliberate. Documented conduct by senior leadership that materially harms the reputational standing of the company during negotiations allows for immediate capital withdrawal. No delay, no penalty. A chair shifted. Papers moved. Someone reached for their copy of the agreement, flipping pages more quickly than before. Charles looked at me again, this time with a different kind of attention. "And you're suggesting that applies here?" "I'm not suggesting anything," I said. "I'm confirming it." For a moment, no one spoke. Edward's phone vibrated against the table, a short, sharp sound that cut through the quiet. He glanced at the screen, then back at me, understanding settling in before anyone else could process it. I stepped away from the table and moved toward the side of the room, where the signal was clearer. The call connected on the second ring. "Samuel," I said, keeping my voice even, "execute the withdrawal. Full amount, effective immediately." There was a pause, brief but sufficient. "Understood," he replied. I ended the call and returned to my seat. The room hadn't caught up yet. Charles was still standing, one hand on the table, as if holding his position would slow what had already begun. Edward's attention remained on his phone now, scanning, confirming. Then another phone vibrated, and another. Edward spoke first, his voice quieter, but carrying further than before. "The primary commitment has been withdrawn." Charles straightened. "That's not possible." Edward didn't look at him. "It's confirmed." The words settled into the room with a different kind of weight. No raised voices, no sudden movements. Just the realization, moving from one person to the next, that the structure they had been relying on no longer existed. I remained where I was, hands resting lightly on the table. No explanation felt necessary. Because the decision had already been made, the moment the cameras recorded what they needed to record. By the time the meeting formally ended, the room no longer belonged to Charles Whitmore. The same chairs were occupied, the same documents lay open on the table, but the structure that had held everything together a few hours earlier had already shifted beyond repair. No one said it directly at first. They didn't need to. Phones stayed in hands longer than usual. Conversations moved into quieter corners. Legal language replaced confidence. Within 2 hours, the board convened again without cameras. This time, the tone was procedural. Motions were raised, seconded, and documented. Charles was placed on administrative leave, pending review of governance conduct. No raised voices, no dramatic exits. Just signatures and silence. The kind that follows decisions made for survival rather than agreement. Outside the building, the day continued as if nothing had changed. Traffic moved. Light reflected off the glass facade. But inside the market, the reaction was immediate. By late afternoon, headlines began to appear. A single line repeated across financial outlets, each version slightly different but carrying the same weight. A major capital commitment withdrawn following a governance incident. Analysts didn't speculate for long. The implications were clear. The stock dropped before the close. Not all at once, but steadily, as information moved faster than reassurance. Suppliers adjusted terms. Internal projections were revised in real time. What had been described as a strategic transition became something else entirely. Uncertainty, documented and distributed. I was asked later why we acted the way we did. The question came in different forms, but the answer didn't change. Respect isn't something you apply after a deal is secured. It's the condition that allows the deal to exist in the first place. Without it, everything else becomes a calculation that no longer holds. Money can cover inefficiency, it can delay consequences, but it doesn't correct the character, and it never replaces the way people choose to treat others when they think it doesn't matter. In business, power rarely announces itself. It doesn't need to. It shows up in small decisions, in ordinary moments, in the way someone responds to a gesture that costs them nothing. That's usually where the outcome is decided, long before anyone realizes what's at stake. So the question isn't about the number that was lost or the position that changed hands. It's simpler than that. If you were in that room, what would you have done differently?